He stared at the judge, his fingers trembling, as he handed over the deed to the only home he'd ever owned. His son didn't even know. Not yet. The judge's eyes held a mixture of pity and professional indifference, a cold and unsettling combination. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the pen, but I signed. I signed away the land, the house, the old barn, every bit of it, for the boy who had already taken so much. What he didn't know was that I was doing it to save him from a fate far worse than anything he had done to me. Before I begin this story, can you tell me where in the world you're listening to from? The porch swing groaned a familiar tune as I rocked, a melody woven into the fabric of my life. It was a sound that told me I was home, that the day's work was done, and the evening was a promise of quiet peace. I watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and deep purple, a spectacle that had played out every night of my 73 years on this patch of land. This wasn't just a ranch, it was my blood, my sweat, and the only legacy I had to pass on. I'd built it with my own hands, every fence post, every barn door, every stone in the fireplace. This land had fed my family for generations. It had held my son, Jareth, as a boy, running wild through the fields, his laughter a bright fleeting echo in the vast open space. I remember him coming in at night, his face smudged with dirt, his hands calloused from holding a hoe, not from the things he held now. I had always hoped he'd take over, that he'd feel the same pull of the soil, the same pride in working with the land instead of against it. But even then, I could see the cracks in his resolve, the way his eyes would look past the horizon, seeing something bigger, shinier, a world away from the dust and the quiet. The first hint of trouble wasn't a phone call or a raised voice. It was a silence, a deep, unsettling silence that grew between us as he got older. The silence of a dream that didn't align with reality. He was a smart boy, brilliant even. He was all about numbers, codes, and things I couldn't understand. He'd sit in his room, hunched over a flickering screen, while I was out in the fields, working with things I could touch and feel. I remember one evening, he came to me, his face alight with a feverish excitement, a fire I had never seen before. He'd just finished a business class in college and he had a plan, a whole blueprint drawn on a sheet of wrinkled paper. He wanted to sell a piece of the ranch, just the western section that was mostly barren, to a developer who was going to build a sprawling subdivision. He called it progress, a way to unlock the ranch's potential. He laid out the numbers, the millions of dollars we could make. The way he talked, it was as if this was the only logical thing to do. He didn't understand that the land wasn't a commodity. It was a living, breathing part of us, and selling it would be like selling a piece of our souls. I looked at the paper, then I looked at his hands, so smooth and clean, not a single callus, and I knew then that his path was going to be a different one from mine. He was a good boy, but he just didn't understand. He saw the world in dollar signs, and I saw it in the calluses on my hands and the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work. My refusal wasn't a shout or an argument, it was a quiet, firm no. This land stays in the family, Jareth. It always has, and it always will. He didn't fight me on it, not really. He just went back to his room, and the silence grew, a silent, festering wound that never healed. He finished college and moved to the city, got some job I never understood, and we only talked on holidays. He was chasing that big, shiny world he'd always seen, leaving me with the ranch, the silence, and the ghosts of his childhood laughter. But I never stopped thinking about it. Every sunset, every sunrise, I'd wonder if he was happy, if he'd found what he was looking for. I'd walk the fields, kicking at the dirt, and a part of me would feel like a failure. I'd failed to teach him the one thing that mattered most, the one thing that gave me a sense of purpose and pride. I missed him. I missed the boy who came in with dirty hands and bright eyes, the boy who wasn't so different from me. He was still my son, and I would do anything for him, even if it meant letting him go. But what I didn't know was that our paths were about to cross again, and that the ranch was just a piece of a much larger and more painful puzzle he was about to put in motion, a puzzle I was about to become the victim of. The financial stress was an old companion, a dull, nagging ache that I'd learned to live with. I had always been good with the land, but not with money. The last few years had been rough, drought and falling prices. I was barely breaking even, sometimes not even that. I had a small savings account, but it was for emergencies, for the day the tractor broke down for good or the vet bill for the cows was too high. I lived a simple life, a life of hard work and honest pay. I never wanted for much. I had my land, my memories, and a handful of friends who were as much a part of the landscape as the ancient oak trees that lined the pasture. I had a lot of pride, and that pride wouldn't allow me to ask Jareth for help. But the truth was, I was tired. My body ached in places it never used to. The sun felt hotter, the days felt longer, and the quiet of the ranch felt less like a comfort and more like a crushing weight. I didn't want to sell, but I was running out of options. Just the day before, I had gone to the bank, hat in hand, to see about a loan to fix the old irrigation system. They had laughed me out of the place. No one wanted to touch an old rancher on the verge of losing everything. I had stood in the parking lot, the asphalt shimmering in the heat, and felt a despair I had never known. The legacy, the land, it was all slipping away, and there was nothing I could do. I was an old man now, and the world was moving on without me. It was in that moment, in that black pit of despair, that my phone buzzed with a call from a number I hadn't seen in years. It was Jareth. I answered it, not with hope, but with the weary resignation of a man who had no other choice. The voice on the other end was familiar yet different, polished and confident. No longer the boy who came in with dirt on his hands. Jareth's words came fast and excited, a cascade of business jargon I could barely follow. He was on the cusp of a major deal, a groundbreaking tech project that would revolutionize something or other. He wasn't talking about farming or cattle. He was talking about millions, a life of unimaginable wealth, a promise of a future I could only dream of for him. He explained the deal, a complex web of investments and corporate partnerships. It all sounded too good to be true. He was getting a $73 million investment. But there was one small insignificant detail that was holding everything up. The investors, he said, wanted an asset, something solid and tangible as collateral, a symbol of stability to back up his big, futuristic idea. He was talking about the ranch. He needed the deed to my ranch just as a formality. He spoke of it with a casual ease, as if asking for the keys to the truck, not the deed to the land I'd spent my entire life on. He assured me it was a temporary measure, a short-term loan that would be paid off the moment the deal went through. He said he'd have the ranch back in my name in no time, and with all the money he'd make, he'd build me a new house, a new barn, anything I wanted. He'd make the ranch everything I'd ever wanted it to be. His voice was so full of promise, of the dreams I'd always had for him, that for a moment I forgot the silent years, the dreams he had so casually discarded. I hesitated for a moment, the phone growing heavy in my hand. The idea of signing away my life's work, even for a moment, sent a cold shiver down my spine. But then I thought of the silence, of the years of distance, of the boy who had looked past the ranch, and I saw a chance to reconnect. He was asking for my help. He was finally coming home, even if it was just over the phone. He was reaching out. Kala, his wife, got on the phone, her voice bright and encouraging, a stark contrast to the quiet reserve I had always felt from her. She spoke of the future, of a life without worry, of taking care of me in my old age. She talked about taking me on vacations, of buying me things I'd never asked for. Her voice was full of a hunger I didn't understand, a desperate need that made me uncomfortable. It was a hunger for something other than what the land could provide. Her words were like a salve on my wounded pride, a balm on the despair I had felt at the bank. The ranch was all I had left, but what was it without family? It was a piece of land, a collection of trees and dirt. It was nothing, but if it could bring Jareth back, if it could make him happy, if it could give him the future he always wanted, then what was a piece of paper? It was a small price to pay. I told him I would do it, that I would sign the papers. The excitement in his voice was palpable. He told me he'd send someone to get the papers, that it was all being handled by his people. He thanked me again and again, and for the first time in years I felt like a father again, like I had finally done something to make my son proud. I hung up the phone, and the sun was gone, but the stars were out, and for the first time in a long time the silence on the ranch felt full of hope. The air was charged with a new energy, a new possibility. I felt a sense of purpose, a sense of rightness that I hadn't felt in years. I was finally giving him what he needed. I was finally giving him his future. What I didn't know was that I was giving him something far more sinister than I could ever have imagined. He wasn't just asking for the land, he was asking for my life, and I had just given it to him. The lawyer's office was a world away from the dust and dirt of my ranch. The air was cool and sterile, smelling of leather and money. Oswin, the lawyer Jareth had sent, was a man who looked like he had never smiled in his life. His suit was perfectly tailored. His hair was slicked back, and his eyes were as cold as a winter storm. He slid the papers across the polished mahogany desk, a thick stack of legalese that seemed designed to confuse a simple man like me. He didn't offer me a glass of water or a comfortable chair. He just pointed to the lines I needed to sign. He didn't explain the terms, he just told me to sign where he had marked. He spoke of my son's immense success, of his visionary project, and I swelled with pride. I didn't ask questions. I didn't read the fine print. I trusted my son. I saw my son in that lawyer's cold eyes, in his sterile office, in his perfectly tailored suit. He was everything I wasn't, and I was proud of it. I was proud that my boy had made it, that he was living the life he always wanted. I was proud that I had, in some small way, helped him get there. I had a lot of pride, maybe too much, and it made me blind. I signed the papers. My signature, a shaky, unpracticed scrawl, felt small and insignificant on the page, like a single blade of grass in a vast empty field. But it was there, and it was a promise I was making to my son, a promise I would keep. It was a promise to myself that I would be there for him, no matter what. I signed with the full weight of my love for him, my hope for his future, and my pride in his success. I signed away the land, but in my heart I was giving him a piece of my soul. I was giving him my trust, my unwavering support, and my unconditional love. I watched as Oswin collected the papers, slid them into a briefcase, and snapped it shut with a final definitive click. The sound was like a nail being hammered into a coffin. I looked at Jareth, who was standing by the window, a victorious smile on his face. He looked at me, and his smile faltered. He looked past me into the street below, and the smile was gone. There was a look in his eyes I couldn't place, a fleeting shadow of something I didn't want to see. But I dismissed it. He was just tired, I thought. He was just overwhelmed. He was on the verge of greatness, and he was taking it all in. I was filled with a sense of immense pride. My boy, the boy who used to run wild on the ranch, was a man now. He was a success. He was everything I wasn't. But then he said something that shattered the moment, a cold, clinical sentence that froze my blood. "It's all handled now, Dad. I'll take care of everything." He didn't offer to take me to lunch or to celebrate. He just handed me a $50 bill and a cab voucher, told me to get a cab to the bus station, and said goodbye. He was in a hurry, he said. He had a meeting. He was a busy man. He was a stranger to me now, a polished, unfamiliar version of my son. He was a man who had no time for his old man. I stood there, the cab voucher in my hand, watching him walk away, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I felt a sense of profound and crushing loneliness, a desolation that felt worse than the despair I had felt at the bank. He was gone, and I was alone. The ranch was gone, but the feeling of loss was so much more than that. I was just a man in a city I didn't know, with a cab voucher in my hand, a man who had just signed away his life for a son who had no time for him. I had signed the papers, I had kept my promise, but he hadn't. He hadn't kept his. I stood there, in the cold, sterile office, and the silence was deafening. I felt like a fool, a proud, foolish old man who had given everything to a son who had nothing to give back. I looked at the $50 bill in my hand. It felt like an insult. It felt like a payment. He didn't want to be my son anymore. He wanted to be my client. He had bought me, and he had thrown me away. I folded the $50 bill and put it in my wallet. I would need it. It was all I had. I was in a strange city, with no home to go to, and a son who didn't want me. The bus ride home was a blur of highway and quiet desolation. I watched the world pass by, a kaleidoscope of cities and towns, of people rushing to places I didn't know. The $50 bill felt like a lead weight in my pocket, a constant reminder of the cold goodbye, of the sterile office, of the promise that had already been broken. I was a man without a home, even though I was heading to the place I had always called home. I stepped off the bus, the familiar scent of dust and heat and dry grass filling my lungs. I walked the last 2 miles to the ranch, a walk I had done 1,000 times, and the familiarity of the path was a small comfort. But as I walked, I noticed things that were out of place. A new tire track in the driveway, a fresh coat of paint on the fence post I had been meaning to fix. I saw a truck, a big, shiny, expensive truck, sitting by the old barn, and I felt a knot of unease tighten in my gut. I walked around the house, and I saw a man in a hard hat, with a clipboard in his hand, looking at the land with a cold, calculating eye. He didn't see the years of hard work, the generations of love, the memories that had been made here. He saw a piece of property. He saw a commodity. He saw a number. I asked him what he was doing, and he just gestured to his clipboard, to a piece of paper that had a name I didn't recognize, and a diagram of the land, all chopped up and sectioned off. He didn't speak to me, just grunted and went back to his work. I felt a cold dread creep over me. This was no temporary loan. This was a hostile takeover. This was an invasion. This was an attack. I went inside, and the house felt different too. The silence was louder, more oppressive. It was the silence of a house that had been violated. a house that had been emptied of its soul. I tried to call Jareth, but the phone went straight to voicemail. I tried to call Kala, and the same thing happened. I left messages, but they were never returned. Days passed. One day became two, two became three. The unease grew into a full-blown panic. I walked the ranch, my boots kicking up the dust, and I felt like a ghost. I didn't belong there anymore. I was a stranger in my own home, on my own land. I saw more surveyors, more strangers, more hard hats, and every single one of them ignored me. It was as if I didn't exist. I was an old man on a piece of land that no longer belonged to me, and everyone knew it but me. I felt a humiliation that burned brighter than the summer sun. I had given everything, and I had been taken for a fool. I had trusted my son, and he had betrayed me. I felt the weight of my foolishness, of my pride, of my blindness, of my love. It was all on my shoulders now, a crushing burden that was far too heavy to bear. I had to do something. I had to know what was going on. I had to know what had happened to my life. I went to the mailbox, an old rusty box that had been a part of my life for so long, and pulled out the day's mail, bills, junk mail, and one official-looking envelope, a letter with a strange name I didn't recognize. I tossed it on the table with the rest, my hands shaking. I didn't want to open it. I knew what it was. I knew what it meant. I knew that I was about to find out the full and devastating truth. I walked away from the table, and for the first time in my life I was afraid of what I would find in my own home. My son had not only taken my land, he had taken my peace, my home, and my pride. And I had let him. I had given it to him. I didn't open the letter. I couldn't. I just stared at it. A venomous snake coiled on the kitchen table. Its simple, official form was a testament to a world I didn't understand. A world where a handshake meant nothing and a signature was everything. The dread was a physical weight in my stomach. Instead of facing the truth, I grabbed my keys, got into my beat-up old truck, and drove to Boone's place. Boone had been my neighbor for 50 years, a man of few words and a strong, unshakable moral compass. I found him in his barn, his hands greasy from working on a tractor engine, his face smudged with dirt. I told him everything: the phone call, the promise, the sterile office, the cab voucher, the surveyors, the strangers on my land, the locked doors, the unanswered calls, the letter on the table. He didn't say anything. He just listened, his face a mask of silent fury. When I was done, he just stood there for a long moment, the silence thick between us. Then he wiped his hands on a rag and told me to get in the truck. We were going to the courthouse. He said he had a bad feeling about this from the start. He said I was too trusting, that I should have known better. He said he saw the way Jareth looked at me sometimes, like I was a problem he had to solve. He said it was just a matter of time before Jareth came for the ranch. I felt a flush of shame and embarrassment, a hot, searing heat that spread from my face to my neck. Boone was right. I should have known. I should have seen it. I had been a fool. The town courthouse was a small, unassuming building, a place where people came to resolve disputes, not to have their lives ripped out from under them. We walked to the office of public records, the scent of old paper and dust filling the air. The woman behind the counter, a kind-faced woman named Cassidy, looked at me with a familiar kindness. She asked me what she could do for me, and I told her my name and the address of the ranch. She typed for a moment, and then she looked at me, a flicker of something in her eyes. It was pity. She turned the screen to me, and there it was, in black and white: the deed to my ranch, transferred to a holding company with a name that sounded like a corporate monster. It was legal, and it was permanent. I felt the world tilt on its axis. The floor, the walls, the air, it all seemed to shift. I wasn't a homeowner anymore. I was a trespasser. I was a man without a home. I was a man who had been stolen from, and the world had let it happen. I felt the blood drain from my face, and I had to lean on the counter to keep from falling. I had given it to him. I had signed the papers. I had made it legal. I had given him the very thing he needed to betray me. I was the architect of my own downfall. Cassidy, her voice soft, told me I needed a lawyer, that maybe there was something that could be done, some way to fight it, but I just shook my head. What was there to fight? I had signed the papers. There was no fine print to read. There was no misunderstanding. I had simply given it away. The realization was a devastating blow. I walked out of the courthouse, the sun a blinding glare, and I felt a sense of defeat, so profound I couldn't breathe. I was a man without a home, a man without a legacy. I was a man who had given his son everything, and he had thrown it back in his face. Boone just put his hand on my shoulder, a simple gesture of comfort that felt like a lifeline. He said he was going to take care of me, that I could stay at his place, that he wouldn't let me go. But I just shook my head. I had to go back to the ranch. I had to face it. I had to see what had become of my home. I drove back, the sun setting on the horizon, and as I pulled up to the house, I saw it. A brand new lock on the front door, shining and new, a mocking symbol of my new reality. The house was no longer mine. The lock was a testament to that. It was a cold, hard symbol of my son's betrayal. It was a sign that I was no longer welcome, no longer a part of the family I had given everything for. I stood on the porch, a trespasser on my own land, and the sun, a beautiful, burning orange, dipped below the horizon, and the world went dark. I stood there for a long time, the cool night air wrapping around me like a shroud. The new lock, a stark, metallic glint in the moonlight, seemed to mock me. It wasn't just a lock, it was a wall, a barrier built, not of steel but of my son's clinical indifference. The silence of the ranch, once a comfort, was now a crushing weight. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, my hands shaking. It was Jareth. I answered, my voice a broken whisper. Jareth, what have you done? I expected a plea for forgiveness, a stumble, a stammer, something that resembled regret. What I got was a calm, dispassionate response. It's business, Dad. You're an old man. You don't understand. The words were like a physical blow, each syllable a blade twisting in my gut. He told me the land was the first part of the deal. The rest, he said, was a formality. He spoke of the $73 million, as if it were a reward for his cleverness, a trophy he had won at the expense of my life. He didn't sound like my son. He sounded like a stranger, a cold, calculating man who had no room for emotion in his world. He offered me a small trust fund, a paltry sum that he said would be enough to get me a nice place to live out my final years. He told me to stop bothering him, that I was in the way, that I was messing up his plans. He told me to take the money and be quiet. He said he had big plans for the ranch. He said he was going to turn it into something great, something he could be proud of. He said he was going to turn it into something I would have never been able to do. I told him I didn't want his money. I told him I wanted my home back. I told him I wanted my life back. He laughed, a short, sharp bark that held no humor. He told me I had no home, that I had signed it away, that it was a done deal. He told me I was a fool to have thought it was a temporary loan. He told me it was a business transaction, pure and simple. He told me I had been compensated, that I should take the money and be grateful. He said if I didn't take the money, he would cut me off completely. He said he would make sure I had nothing. He said he would make sure I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back. I told him he was a monster. I told him he had broken my heart. I told him he was no longer my son. He just laughed again, a sound that was full of a cold, clinical indifference. He said he didn't care what I thought. He said he had what he wanted, and that was all that mattered. The call ended abruptly, the line going dead. The silence that followed was worse than the silence that had been there before. It was the silence of a life that had been destroyed. It was the silence of a man who had lost everything. It was the silence of a father who had been betrayed by his own son. I walked away from the porch, from the locked door, from the house that was no longer mine, and I felt the weight of my shame. I had given it all to him, and he had thrown it all away. I walked to Boone's place, the night air cool on my skin. He was waiting for me on his own porch, a single light burning. He didn't say anything, just gestured to the empty chair beside him. I sat down, and the silence was a comfort. I told him everything that had been said. He just listened, his face a grim mask. When I was done, he just shook his head. He's a cold one, Lyle. I always knew it. His words were a small comfort, a quiet confirmation of what I already knew. I had raised a stranger. I had raised a man who had no heart, no soul, no love for anything but money. I had raised a man who was willing to destroy his own father for a fleeting promise of wealth. The world had gone mad, and I was a lonely witness to its madness. I felt a burning hatred for my son, a cold, bitter, consuming rage. I wanted to hurt him. I wanted to make him feel the pain he had inflicted on me. I wanted to make him pay. But what could I do? I was a man without a home, a man without a future, a man without a son. I was a man who had been defeated. I felt a profound sense of helplessness, a feeling that was worse than the shame, worse than the betrayal, worse than the loneliness. I was a man with nothing left to lose. But what I didn't know was that I had something to lose. I had something they couldn't take, something they didn't know I had, something that could turn the tables on him and his cold, heartless world, and I was about to use it to fight for my life. I stood in the stark, minimalist office of Maribel, the pro bono lawyer Boone had found for me. She was a young woman, her face a mix of fierce intelligence and genuine kindness, an expression I hadn't seen on a lawyer's face before. Her office was cluttered with files, books, and the comfortable mess of someone who worked long hours and cared about her clients. I told her the whole story, from the phone call to the eviction notice to Jarrett's cold clinical call. She listened patiently, her eyes never leaving mine. She asked questions about the fine print, about the nature of the deal, about what exactly I had signed. I couldn't answer any of them. I had trusted him. I had trusted my son. She was sympathetic, but also pragmatic. Lyle, she said, her voice gentle, you signed the papers. It was a willing transaction. Proving fraud will be an uphill battle. We have to show that he intentionally deceived you, that he never intended to return the ranch. That's a very difficult thing to prove. Her words were a splash of cold water in my face. It was as if she was telling me something I already knew. There was no hope. There was no way to get it back. I had been a fool, and now I had to pay the price. But then she looked at me again, and her expression changed. It was a look of resolve. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. She said we would file a lawsuit for fraud and breach of contract. She said we would go to court and make him face me. She said we would do everything we could to get my life. I felt a glimmer of hope, a small spark of light in the darkness that had been my life. I had an ally. I had someone in my corner, someone who was willing to fight for me. Even when I had nothing left to offer. I was a man who had been left to die, and a kind stranger was offering me a lifeline. The courthouse was a cold, impersonal place, a fortress of granite and marble. Jareth was there, his face impassive, his suit perfectly tailored. His lawyers a phalanx of silent, intimidating men in sharp suits. He didn't look at me. He just stared straight ahead, as if I was a ghost. His lawyers, slick and professional, presented their case with the confidence of men who knew they had already won. They presented the signed papers, the legal documents, the contract with my signature on it. They painted me as a greedy old man who was now trying to get more money from his successful son. They said I had been compensated, that I had been given a generous offer, and that I had refused it. They made me sound like a senile old fool who was now making up a story about betrayal. I felt a flush of anger. I wanted to stand up and shout, to tell the judge the truth, to tell him what kind of monster Jareth had become. But I couldn't. I was just an old man with a broken heart, and they were the professionals. They were the ones with the power. They were the ones with the truth. I looked at Jareth, at the man who used to be my son, and I saw a stranger. I saw a man who was willing to destroy his own father for a fleeting promise of wealth. He had no shame, no guilt, no remorse. He was a machine, a cold, unfeeling robot that had no room for love or family or a heart. The judge, a stoic woman with a tired expression, listened to the arguments, and then she looked at me. Her eyes held a mixture of pity and frustration. She said that the burden of proof was on me, that I had to prove that I had been deceived. She said that a signed contract was a signed contract. She said that as of now, the case would be dismissed. The words were a death sentence. My heart sank. I had lost. I had lost everything, and there was nothing I could do about it. The world had gone mad, and I was a lonely witness to its madness. But what I didn't know was that the fight was far from over. I had lost this battle, but the war had just begun. And in this war, I had a secret weapon, something Jareth had no idea about, something that could turn the tables, something that could give me my life back. And I was about to use it. Maribel was not a woman who gave up easily. After the court hearing, she took me back to her office, and we sat in the quiet of the afternoon, the silence a stark contrast to the sterile chaos of the courtroom. She was angry, not at me, but at the injustice of it all. She said that there had to be more to it, that a $73 million deal for an old ranch didn't make sense. She said that there had to be a reason Jareth had been so desperate for the land, a reason he had been willing to throw away his own father. She said that she would dig deeper, that she would find the truth, even if it meant she had to go through 1,000 layers of corporate lies. She went to the public records office, and she spent days poring over every document, every permit, every piece of paper related to the holding company and the deal. I waited, sitting on Boone's porch, the silence of the country a balm on my wounded soul. I watched the sun rise and fall, and I waited. I was an old man, and I had nothing but time. I had no home, no son, no future. I was just a man with a past and a hope that maybe, just maybe, the past would set me free. She called me on a Friday afternoon, her voice a low, urgent whisper. Lyle, I found it. She told me to come to her office, and I drove there, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked into her office, and she was standing there, a single sheet of paper in her hand. She slid it across the desk, and I looked at it, and the world tilted on its axis. The document wasn't a contract, or a permit, or a legal document. It was a map of the ranch, with a large section of it outlined in red. And in that section there were words. Words that sent a cold shiver down my spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The words were hazardous waste disposal site. The land was being used to dump toxic waste. The words were a death sentence. Not for me, but for the land, for the animals, for the water, for the life that had been sustained there for centuries. The words were a revelation. This wasn't about progress. This wasn't about a tech campus. This wasn't about a new life. This was about money. Pure and simple. Jareth was going to poison the land, my land, his home, his legacy, for a few $1,000,000. The money he had promised me was a lie. The deal was a lie. He had lied to me, to himself, to the world. He had lied about everything. The formality was a plan to poison the soil I had worked my entire life to nourish. The business transaction was a conspiracy to turn my legacy into a graveyard. I felt a rage so pure, so all-consuming, that I thought my heart would burst. It was a rage that had no words, a rage that was a silent scream. I had been betrayed, not just by my son, but by a world that had no regard for life, for truth, for anything but money. The land, the very thing I had given to him, was going to be the instrument of its own destruction. And he was the one who was going to do it. Maribel looked at me, her eyes full of a quiet devastation. She said she had found a back door in the contract, a clause that mentioned the specific use of the land. She said she could use this to file another lawsuit, to show that Jareth had lied, that he had committed fraud. But I didn't care about the lawsuit. I didn't care about the money. I cared about the legacy. I cared about the life that was going to be destroyed. I looked at the map, at the red-marked section, and I saw a future I could not bear to contemplate. A future of poisoned water, of dead animals, of a legacy that was a bitter memory. A future where my son was the monster who had destroyed it all. I felt a cold, determined resolve settle in my gut. I was going to fight, not for the money, not for the pride, but for the land, for the legacy, for the future. But what could a man with nothing do against a world with everything? I was a man with no home, no money, no power. I was a man with nothing left to lose. But I had a secret that I had kept for a lifetime, a secret that was my last best hope, and it was a secret that was about to change everything. The map of the ranch, with its ominous red outline, was a constant replay in my mind. It was a scene from a nightmare, a vision of what my son had been willing to do to get his hands on money. The land I had nurtured, the soil I had bled into, was just a canvas for his greed. The thought of it, of the toxic waste seeping into the ground, poisoning the water table that fed Boone's farm and the whole valley, was unbearable. It was a betrayal that went beyond me. It was a betrayal of the land itself. I looked at Maribel, and I saw the same fire in her eyes. She had a plan, a legal plan, but it was going to be a long, expensive battle. Jareth had a fleet of lawyers, a whole army of men in suits who would fight us every step of the way. She was working pro bono, but the court fees, the filing costs, the legal expenses, they would all add up. She looked at me, and her expression was one of regret. I can only do so much, Lyle. It's going to take a lot of money to fight this. Do you have any resources at all? Any savings? I felt the shame wash over me again. I had nothing. I had given it all to my son. I had nothing to fight with. I was a man with no home, no money, and no power. I was a man who had been defeated. But then I remembered something. Something I hadn't told anyone. Something that was a secret I had kept for my entire life. I looked at her and I smiled, a small, weary, and determined smile. I have something, I said. Something they don't know about. She looked at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. What is it? She asked. What do you have? I took a deep breath, and the words came out in a rush, a lifetime of secrets pouring out of me. I told her about the old mines, the ones that had been in the back 40 since before my grandfather's time. They had been closed for decades, abandoned, forgotten. But as a boy I had found them. I had spent my summers exploring them, mapping them out, learning their secrets. I had found a small vein of gold. It wasn't much, just a thin, glittering line in the rock, but it was there, and I had kept it a secret. I had been quietly mining it for decades, a little bit at a time, just enough to not attract attention. I had been saving it, not for a rainy day, but for a future I had always believed would be for my family. I had kept it a secret from everyone, even Jareth. I had wanted to tell him, to show him the secret of the land, the real treasure that was there. But I never did. I didn't want him to see it as a commodity. I wanted him to see it as a part of the ranch, a part of our life, not something to be sold for money. The gold was my pride, my secret, my legacy. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. It was enough to fight. It was enough to get my life. It was enough to save the ranch. Maribel's eyes widened. She was a lawyer, a woman of facts and figures, and she was looking at me as if I was telling her a fairy tale. But I wasn't. It was real. The gold was real. It was in my safe, in my old barn, a testament to a lifetime of hard work and quiet resilience. It was a secret I had kept for a lifetime, and it was about to be my salvation. I looked at her, and my resolve was stronger than it had ever been. We were going to fight. We were going to win. We were going to save the ranch. I went back to the ranch, and I went to my old barn, and I opened the safe. The gold was there, a small, heavy pile of shimmering yellow. It wasn't a lot, not in the eyes of a man who dealt with millions. But it was everything to me. It was my life's work. It was my secret. It was my hope. I took a piece of it, and I put it in my pocket. I went to the bank, and I sold it. I watched as the money was transferred to my account, a quiet, reassuring number. I had the money to fight. I had the power to fight. I had the leverage to fight. I called Maribel, and I told her to prepare for a new battle. I was a man with a home, a man with a future, a man with a son, and I was going to fight for them all. But what I didn't know was that my secret would not be a secret for long. Maribel was a whirlwind of motion and quiet determination. She took my story, the map, the toxic waste deal, the signed papers, the betrayal, and she turned it into a weapon. We went to the local news, a small, unassuming station with a kind, curious reporter named Trina. I sat in a chair, the lights bright in my face, and I told her everything. I told her about Jareth, the boy who used to run wild on the ranch, the boy who had become a stranger. I told her about the deal, the lies, the betrayal, the lies, and the toxic waste. I showed her the map, the red-marked section, the death sentence for the land I loved. I didn't hold back. I let my heart pour out, all the hurt, all the anger, all the betrayal, all the love. I didn't care what people thought. I didn't care about my pride. I just wanted the truth to be out there. I wanted the world to know what my son had done. The story went viral. The image of the old rancher, the man who had lost his home to his own son, a son who was going to poison the land, resonated with people all over the country. The internet, a place I had never understood, lit up with a furious, righteous rage. The story was everywhere. On the news, on social media, in newspapers. The holding company, the nameless, faceless corporate monster, was suddenly a public enemy. Jareth's name, his face, his business, they were all in the headlines. The $73 million deal, the one he had been so proud of, was now a symbol of greed and betrayal. The investors, a group of powerful men who had no room for emotion, were suddenly facing a public relations nightmare. They were being called out, shamed, and ridiculed. They were a part of the story, and the story was one of betrayal, of greed, of a son who had sold his soul for money. The public outrage was a firestorm, a furious, righteous inferno that was consuming Jareth's world. I watched it all from Boone's porch, the same porch where I had sat in silence, a man with nothing left to lose. I felt a sense of vindication, a small, quiet triumph that was a balm on my wounded pride. He had taken my life, and I had taken his. He had taken my home, and I had taken his reputation. He had taken my future, and I had taken his money. The phone rang again. It was Jareth. He wasn't calm anymore. He was frantic. His voice was full of panic and rage. He was yelling, screaming, calling me a traitor, a liar, a fool. He said I had ruined his life. He said I had destroyed everything he had worked for. He said I had no right to do what I had done. I just listened. I didn't say a word. I just let him yell, let the rage pour out of him. I let him feel the pain he had inflicted on me. I let him feel the betrayal he had inflicted on me. I let him feel the loss he had inflicted on me. He said the investors were pulling out, that the deal was collapsing, that the $73 million was gone. He said I had ruined him. I just hung up. The silence that followed was a glorious thing, a silence that was full of victory, of revenge, of a righteous retribution. He had taken my life, and I had taken his. He had taken my home, and I had taken his future. He had taken my legacy, and I had taken his soul. But what I didn't know was that the victory was a fleeting thing. The panicked phone call from Jareth, the rage, the desperation, the frantic pleas, they were a twisted kind of music to my ears. He was suffering, and for the first time in a long time I felt a grim satisfaction. He was feeling the pain he had so casually inflicted on me. He was losing everything just as I had. The tables had turned. The firestorm of public outrage was a beautiful, brilliant thing. It was a testament to the power of a single story, of a single voice. It was a confirmation that the world was not as cold and heartless as I had thought. But the victory was a fleeting one. I knew it. The firestorm would eventually die down. The news cycle would move on, and then I would be left with a monster who had nothing left to lose. I was a man with a ranch, a man with a secret, a man with a son who had become a monster. And the monster was about to come for me. I felt a sense of dread, a cold, nagging fear that was worse than the loneliness, worse than the betrayal, worse than the loss. He called me again the next day. This time he wasn't yelling. His voice was a quiet, desperate whisper. He was in a different place, a place of shame and defeat. He said the deal was dead. The investors had pulled out. The money was gone. He said he had lost everything. He said he was a failure. He said he was a fool. He said he was a ghost. He said he was begging me to stop, to drop the lawsuit, to go away, to let him have some peace. He offered me a new deal. He said he would give me a piece of the ranch back, just the house and a small section of the land. He said he would let me live out my days there in peace. He said it was the best he could do. He said it was all he had left. I listened to him, and a part of me, the old man, the father, the man who had loved his son more than life itself, wanted to say yes. I wanted to forgive him. I wanted to let him go. I wanted to give him a second chance. But another part of me, the man who had been betrayed, the man who had lost everything, the man who had been called a fool, said no. I couldn't. Not now. Not after what he had done. Not after what he had been willing to do. I told him no. I told him he had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. I told him there was no deal, no second chance, no forgiveness. I told him I was going to fight. I was going to fight for the land. I was going to fight for the legacy. I was going to fight for my life. The call ended abruptly, and I felt a sense of victory, a sense of triumph. I had won. He had lost. He had tried to take my life, and I had taken his. But the victory was a fleeting one. I had a new enemy now, an enemy that was far more dangerous than Jareth, an enemy that had a lot of money, a lot of power, and a lot of anger. I had made enemies of men who had no room for emotion, no room for a man who had nothing. They were going to come for me, and I knew it. I had the gold, the secret, the leverage, but they had the power, and power, I knew, was a more dangerous thing than money. I had a feeling that the battle had just begun, and that the first round had been a warm-up. I had a feeling that the real fight was just beginning. But what I didn't know was that the next call I would get would not be from a lawyer, or a reporter, or a friend. It would be from Kala, my daughter-in-law, a woman who had been a silent partner in the conspiracy, a woman who was about to reveal a secret that would turn my world upside down. The phone rang, and the name on the screen was Kala. I hesitated. I hadn't spoken to her since the day I signed the papers. She had been a silent participant in the betrayal, a woman who had encouraged her husband to take my life. She was a woman who had no room for emotion, no room for family, no room for a heart. I was filled with a mix of anger and resentment, a cold, bitter rage. But I answered. Her voice when she spoke was not the bright, encouraging voice I remembered. It was a broken, desperate whisper, a sound that was full of a quiet devastation. "Lyle," she said, "I'm so sorry." The words were a shock. I had expected a torrent of anger, of shame, of blame. I had expected a woman who was a reflection of her husband. I had expected a woman who was as cold and heartless as he was. But I was wrong. She was a woman who was broken. She was a woman who was on the verge of a breakdown. She told me everything. She told me that Jareth's business had been failing for years. She told me that the $73 million was their only hope, their last chance to get out of debt. She told me that the toxic waste deal was a last resort, a desperate attempt to save their lives. She told me that she had been a silent partner in the conspiracy, a woman who had been complicit in the betrayal. She had been afraid. She had been desperate. She had been a woman who had no other choice. She told me that she had been watching the news, watching the public outrage, watching her husband's life fall apart, and she couldn't take it anymore. She was a woman who was on the verge of losing her mind. But she wasn't calling for herself. She was calling for Numa, their daughter, my granddaughter. "Lyle," she said, her voice a plea, "you have to stop. Not for us, not for me, not for him, for her." She told me that Numa, a sweet, kind, innocent girl, was heartbroken. She was being ridiculed at school, her father was being called a monster, her family was falling apart. She didn't understand. She was just a little girl, and she was in the middle of a war she didn't understand. Kala told me that Noma had been asking about me, asking why her father had hurt her grandfather, why her family was so broken. She told me that Noma had been having nightmares, that she had been crying herself to sleep. She was a girl who was suffering, and she was suffering because of me, because of my pride, because of my revenge. I was a man who had nothing, a man who had lost everything, but I had a granddaughter, I had a family, and I was about to lose them too. Kyla told me that Jareth's investors, in their rage, were coming for me. They had a team of lawyers, a team of men who would stop at nothing to get their money back. They would not be as forgiving as Jareth. They would not be as kind as he was. They were going to come for me. They were going to come for my gold. They were going to come for my life. They were going to destroy me. And they were going to do it with a cold, clinical indifference that was far worse than Jareth's rage. I felt a cold dread settle in my gut. I had thought I was fighting for my life, for my ranch, for my legacy. But I was fighting for something else. I was fighting for a revenge that was destroying my family. I was fighting for a pride that was killing my soul. I was a man who had nothing left to lose, but I was about to lose the one thing that mattered most. The one thing that was 1,000 times more valuable than the land, the gold, the money, the legacy. The phone call from Kala was a turning point. The rage, the vindication, the pride. It all evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard truth. My quest for revenge, my righteous anger, was a blade that was cutting not just Jareth, but my granddaughter, my own blood. My victory was a hollow one. The public humiliation, the destruction of Jareth's world. It was all a bitter, futile exercise in pride. It was a small, sad play on a grand stage, and the audience, my family, was suffering. The thought of Nilma, a little girl with a broken heart, crying herself to sleep because of the war I was fighting, was an unbearable weight on my soul. I had to stop, not for him, not for me, but for her. I was a man with nothing left to lose, and I was about to lose the one thing that mattered most. I had to make a choice between my pride and my family. I called Maribel. I told her to put a stop to everything. The lawsuits, the media interviews, the public battle, all of it. She was surprised. She was disappointed. She had fought so hard for me, and she was on the verge of victory. She couldn't understand. She was a lawyer, a woman of facts and figures, and she couldn't understand a man who was willing to give up a fight he was on the verge of winning. Lyle, she said, her voice full of a quiet concern, you're a hair's breadth away from getting your ranch back. Are you sure you want to do this? I told her I was sure. I told her that the ranch was just a piece of land, and that my granddaughter was a piece of my soul. I told her that a man with a broken soul was no man at all. She understood. She was a lawyer, but she was also a human being. She had a heart that was full of compassion and a quiet understanding of the human condition. She was a good woman, and she was a good friend. She said she would do it. She said she would handle everything. She said she would make sure that I was safe. I was a man who had nothing, but I had a friend who was willing to give me everything. I was a man who had lost his way, but I had a friend who was willing to show me the way back home. I was a man who had been defeated, but I had a friend who was willing to stand by my side. I had to face them. The investors, the faceless corporate monsters who were coming for me. I had to face them and make a deal. I called my son's lawyer, Oswin, and I told him I wanted to meet with his clients. He was surprised. He was shocked. He was a man who had no room for emotion, and he couldn't understand a man who was willing to give up a fight he was winning. He told me he would set up the meeting. A few days later, I was in a room, a cold, sterile room, with 3 men in sharp suits. They were the investors. They were the ones who had given Jareth the money. They were the ones who were going to destroy me. They were the ones who were going to take everything from me. They were the ones who were going to take my gold. They were the ones who were going to take my life. They offered me a deal. Drop the lawsuit, one of them said, and we'll make sure your son is taken care of. He didn't mean they would give him a job. He meant they would make sure he was financially ruined, that he would never work again, that he would be a ghost in a world of men who had everything. They were offering me a choice between my revenge and my family. They were offering me a chance to destroy the monster that had been my son, and in doing so, to save my family. The choice was clear. I was a man who had lost everything, but I was not a man who was willing to lose his family. I agreed to the deal, but with a condition. I wanted to see my son. I wanted to see Jareth and Kala, and I wanted to see them in a place that had nothing to do with money or corporations or courtrooms. I wanted to see them in a place that was neutral, a place that was just a quiet, unassuming place where a father could talk to his son. We met at a small diner on the edge of town, a place with checkered floors and a smell of coffee and bacon. They walked in, and I barely recognized them. Jareth was a ghost of a man, his suit wrinkled, his eyes hollow. Kala was pale and thin, her face etched with a quiet, devastating sadness. They looked like people who had lost a war they had started. I was filled with a mix of pity and a quiet, sad vindication. They had lost everything. They had nothing left, and they had no one to blame but themselves. I looked at them, and I saw a reflection of myself. The man who had been defeated, the man who had lost everything. But I was not a man who was willing to let them go. I was a man who had nothing, but I had a family, and a family was 1,000 times more valuable than money or pride or revenge. I had a choice to make, and I was going to make it. I told them I had a deal for them. I told them I was going to drop the lawsuit. I told them that the public firestorm would die down. I told them that they would have their lives back, but they would have to pay a price. I pulled a document out of my pocket, a single sheet of paper that was folded and creased. It was the deed to the ranch, but it was signed over to our granddaughter, Neoma. The document had her name on it, and it had a note attached to it, a note that said the deed would be in her name, and that a trust fund would be set up for her education. I told Jareth that the ranch was no longer a commodity. It was a legacy. It was a future. It was a home. It was a place for his daughter to grow up, a place where she could learn the values he had forgotten. I told him that the ranch was not a place to be sold for money. It was a place to be nurtured, a place to be loved, a place to be a family. He looked at the document, and his face was a mix of shock and confusion. He didn't understand. He was a man who had lost everything, and I was giving it back to him. But I was not giving it back to him. I was giving it back to our granddaughter. I was giving it back to the future. I was giving it back to a family that had been broken, and I was going to make it whole again. And then I told him about the gold. I told him about the secret I had kept for a lifetime, the secret I had been saving for my family. I told him that I had been saving it, not for a rainy day, but for a family that was 1,000 times more valuable than money. I told him that I was going to use it to pay off his debts, to help him start over, to give him a second chance. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a quiet shame, a quiet devastation. He was a man who had lost everything, and I was giving him a second chance, but it was not a chance to get money. It was a chance to get his life back. I told him that I was going to need his help. I was going to need his help to restore the ranch, to make it what it once was. I was going to need his help to build a new life, a new legacy, a new future. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of tears. The sun, a tired, weary orange, dipped below the horizon, casting a long golden shadow across the field. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of dry grass and hope. I sat on the porch swing, the same one that had grown a familiar tune for so many years, and I watched Jareth and Kala working in the field. They were dirty, their clothes smeared with dirt and dust, their hands calloused and raw. They were working on the new irrigation system, a project that was a long way from a tech campus and 1,000 miles from the cold, sterile world they had left behind. They were working, and they were happy. A quiet, contented happiness that was 1,000,000 times more valuable than the $73 million they had lost. They were working for their future, for their daughter, for their family, and for the land they had tried to destroy. The toxic waste deal was dead. The investors had backed off. The public firestorm had died down. The lawyers had gone home. The world had moved on, and a new one had begun. A world that was a new and beautiful thing. I had paid off their debts, and I had helped them start over. We were a family again, not a business. We were a family, not a transaction. We were a family, not a war. We were a family, not a battlefield. We were a family that had been broken, and we were a family that had been put back together again, not with money, but with love, forgiveness, and a quiet, stubborn hope. Neoma, my granddaughter, would come to the ranch every weekend, and she would run wild through the fields, her laughter a bright, beautiful echo in the vast open space. She would come in at night, her face smudged with dirt, her hands calloused from holding a hoe, and she would look at me with eyes that were full of a quiet, innocent love. She was a girl who was home. She was a girl who was a part of a family that was a new and beautiful thing, and I was a man who had been defeated, but I was a man who had won. Jareth came to me one evening, his face tired but his eyes full of a quiet, burning gratitude. He sat on the porch swing beside me, and the silence was a comfort. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "I'm so sorry for everything. I didn't say anything. I just put my hand on his shoulder, a simple, quiet gesture that was 1,000 times more powerful than words. I had a son who had been a stranger, and I was a father who had been a fool. But we were a family now. We were a family that had been broken, and we were a family that had been healed. It had been a long, hard journey. It had been a journey of betrayal, of loss, of a quiet, consuming rage. But it had been a journey that had led me back home. It had been a journey that had led me back to my family, to my legacy, to my life. I looked at the sunset and I saw a new life, a new beginning, a new future. I was an old man and I had lost everything, but I had gained everything. The ranch was still here, but now it was a part of something else. It was a part of a family that had been broken, and it was a part of a family that had been put back together again. It was a part of a legacy that was a new and beautiful thing. I was a man who had been defeated, but I was a man who had won. And I was a man who had a son. My son got 73 milliamp and threw me out, but 3 days later, he was begging for my ranch, and when he did, I gave it back to him. Not the money, not the fame, but the life he had so carelessly thrown away. I gave it back to him, and in doing so I had finally found a way to give it back to myself. The sunset was beautiful. It was a sunset that was full of hope, full of love, and full of a quiet, peaceful, and unbreakable family.